Hello there, Simon Dowling here, and welcome back to Teaming with Possibility. Well, I say back. I've got no way of knowing whether this is in fact your first time or not. If it is, welcome. It's good to have you here. This is the podcast where we get to have a conversation about teams and what's possible. The power of groups, the power of the collective. I am somebody who works in that space all the time, as a facilitator, as a mentor, as a coach to teams, and it's something I'm fascinated by, is that power of groups. But it's not always easy. I mean, there's heaps of promise associated with the idea of a team. Go team! But there's plenty of challenge in there as well. So it's a bit of a paradox. You bring a group of high-performing individuals together, what do you get? Not necessarily a team. Episode 16. It is also the third episode of Season 2, which is all made up. Season 2. Season 2 is just what I'm calling the bit after a break. But it's interesting, you know, this is season 2, there was a break, this is episode 3 in that season, and it dawned on me that I started this podcast about a year ago, and the reason I wanted to start this was to be able to be in conversation with you, the listener, a conversation about all these things associated with teams, the challenges of leading teams. I wanted to be able to kind of share, almost debrief some of the stuff that I'm seeing, observing in the work that I do, and so forth. Of course, the irony is that sitting in a studio by yourself with a microphone and looking at the camera doesn't feel like a conversation at all. And so what I think I started to do, particularly coming into season 2, is to start to treat this as content more than conversation. In other words, how can I provide you with content? How can I make sure that I am creating some great episodes? And started to do a bit more preparation around what I wanted to actually talk about in those. But I've realized that's not really, like if you want that sort of content, I've got a blog post, you should sign up for that. Jump on over, simondowling.com.au. I've got my LinkedIn posts that I regularly do. But this is different, and I want to make sure that it stays different. I want it to feel much more intimate, if I can use that word, more connected, more like, and it is unscripted. I know what the theme is as I come into these episodes, but I don't necessarily have a script of what I want to say. So I'm just sharing that with you kind of by way of commitment, I guess, but also by way of a bit of a reset on how I want to approach these episodes. It also means it's interesting for those of you watching on YouTube. Obviously, I'm looking at you right now, straight down the barrel of the camera. And I think the other thing about recording these for video and putting them up on YouTube is that it is easy for me, particularly as someone with a performance background, to start wanting to perform before the camera. But that's not, in fact, what that camera is there for. It's because for those of us that feel like, you know what, conversations are better when you can see someone, that's why the camera's here. But of course, a lot of you will not be watching this on YouTube. You'll be listening to it with perhaps earphones in your ear. Maybe you're driving somewhere, maybe you're walking, maybe you're on the train, maybe you're on the treadmill, maybe you're cooking your wicked bolognese pasta, who knows? So clearly this is meant to be a conversation independent of video. Anyhow, that's just a little bit of a kind of honest moment of reflection. Of course, the other thing about a conversation is I kind of don't know who's listening and who's not. I always invite in these episodes, and would particularly invite you, if you are listening and you're getting something from these podcasts, please do pop me an email. Send an email to me at podcast is the email address, podcast@simondowling.com.au, just to say, hey, I'm listening. And maybe even as part of that, you might want to tell me, what are you getting from these? What do you want me to focus on? And so on. I am hoping in the new year, because I'm recording this on the 1st of December, pinch of the punch, first day of the month, I am planning to bring, some occasional conversation partners into this as well. Conversational partners. Speaking of conversation, I actually thought that would be a useful theme to reflect on in this episode. Conversations in teams, because so much of what teams are able to achieve, so much of their growth, so much of the magic that they create, so much of the way in which they're able to harness that kind of collective genius, this term I love and keep coming back to, comes down to the way the team has conversations. And by conversations, it might be spontaneous corridor conversations, it might be conversations that we have in formal settings such as meetings or workshops. And in the work that I do as a facilitator in particular, or when I'm coaching a team, I guess the thing that I'm really looking to do, particularly as a facilitator, is to give shape to conversations and make those conversations not just easier, which is kind of literally what facilitation means, to make easy, but also to make them as meaningful and as rich and as productive as possible, whatever productive means. And that's where my eye is trained. And I think for me, the thing that I always hope to bring to a team when I'm working with them is to give them an experience of a conversation and the benefits of a conversation unlike ones that they might normally have, not just for that moment in time, but hopefully so that they can learn themselves or kind of become more hungry to have conversations like that in the future without needing me there. And that's building what I often like to describe for teams as their conversational intelligence. Conversational intelligence, which is a term, I think it was coined, it certainly was made popular by a lady by the name of Judith Glaser, who describes herself as an organizational anthropologist, which I think is pretty cool. Imagine having that on your business card. She wrote a book called, funnily enough, Conversational Intelligence, where she really explores this idea of the skill, not just for teams, but for individuals, for leaders, for all of us. Because so much of the magic that we create, the connection that we build, the trust that we strengthen really comes from the conversations that we have and the way that we do it. Because really, I mean, if I think about a conversation, we could be thinking of this very much as a question of agenda and process. And I think I do want to touch on that in a second, like how do you design a conversation? But actually, more than anything, a conversation in a team setting is a situation where people are sending a bunch of cues to each other about how they feel about one another. So we tend to take cues and learn pretty quickly around to what extent does this team value my opinion? To what extent does this team respect my point of view? To what extent am I a good fit for this team, if that even matters? To what extent does this team welcome difference? To what extent is it okay for me to voice up an opinion and to be heard without judgment? And so that in turn builds the kind of conditions within which this team can operate from a place of, Amy Edmondson's concept, a place of psychological safety, a place of courage. So there's that aspect of things. There's the relational aspect of the conversations that we have and how it either strengthens us collectively, helps us to build that collective courage, or diminishes us in some way. Maybe because it diminishes certain individuals in the team. It makes them feel less confident. It makes them feel less welcome. It makes them feel that they need to be more careful about what they say. So we're constantly shaping the culture of a team through the way those conversations happen. So that's one big part of conversational intelligence, is understanding that kind of ripple effect that every meeting has on the kind of team that we choose to be. Which is why, by the way, I do think the work that you can do as a team around the explicit work you can do around courage. I think I might have touched on this in an earlier episode, perhaps, but if not, we'll come back to it. We'll probably come back to it anyway. But this work that a team can do explicitly on courage. Why do we need courage? What do we need to be courageous for? And what does it take for us to feel encouraged by one another? So understanding that kind of relational and emotional impact we're having on each other, psychological impact we're having on each other all the time as a group of social creatures. I suppose the other side, though, of conversational intelligence is just working out how do you weave a conversation such that it is a really useful one, a really valuable one, a conversation that does more than simply exchanges information, which is often just a lot of noise. And this is, I think, where a lot of teams struggle, is that their attempts to tackle issues or to respond to questions or to dive into, just imagine, right? You're in a team meeting, there's something on the agenda. The choice to dive into it at that point, and people just start expressing points of view or sharing, someone's done some preparation, so they bung a PowerPoint slide up on. Everyone gets so excited by that. Woohoo! A slide presentation. The moment an issue presents itself for conversation, how do we tackle that in a way that is more than simply just an exchange of noise and information? And if you go one step further than that, I think it needs to also be more than simply the act of very quickly reaching an outcome. Because if the intention is to very quickly reach an outcome, and I think Judith Glaser in her book would call this the second level. So that first level of conversation is the information exchange. The second level is what she would call transactional conversations, which is where the idea is just to get to the end of this conversation as quickly as possible and get to that outcome, which means we're not particularly worried about the quality, the richness of the conversation, but more, is there a product of it? And that, I think, is often, you can tell that you're in transactional mode because it might be 2 or 3 dominant voices in a conversation in a team that really know that they're well equipped to, that they are confident enough to, and perhaps impatient enough to get us to the end of this conversation as quickly as possible. And the measure of success is, tick, we're done. And that's sometimes driven by the fact that we've just got so many items on the agenda in such a compressed amount of time. Or if it's not an agenda, so much that we need to get through in the day in such a compressed amount of time that we're just focused on speed of movement, like pace. Let's get stuff done. So that kind of transactional conversation is, have we got what we need? Right, let's decide, let's move on. But the roadkill along the side of that might well be the perspectives that weren't tapped into, that weren't mined, that weren't discovered, that weren't learned, that weren't recognized, and all of those things. Which sometimes leads people to move to the third level in Judith Glaser's structure, the third level of conversation, which is positional conversation, which is where the conversation does more than simply exchange information. It does more than simply than just get to a decision. It actually represents people trying to assert a point of view and claim their position, and she calls that positional conversation. So assert a point of view, claim a position. So if you can imagine someone saying, well, here's how I think something should be done. Someone else says, here's how I think something should be done. Or here's how I think resources should be allocated. Here's how I think resources should be allocated. Here's the colour I think we should, print these workbooks in. Here's the colour I think. I don't think we should have workbooks at all. And so the conversation actually comes people kind of almost talking past each other, but in order to assert their point of view and to dominate the conversation, not just for the outcome, but for the positional power that emerges from that. It's kind of like animals in the desert, or what, the desert, in the jungle, in the bush. Come on, Australia, we're going bush. Jockeying for power by having a wrangle, and by the end of it, whoever emerges as the victor is the alpha, the dominant. And positional conversations can often feel about like that. People jockeying for power. And in teams, sometimes that'll happen and others will sit back and just go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm here having to observe this. Why do they not sell tickets, and where can I get popcorn? But I think in all of these situations, maybe the question is, what do we really want our conversations to mature into? What is the quality that we would love of our conversations? Judith Glaser talks about this fourth level to emerge to as being transformative conversations. Or I think she also uses the language, I certainly like the language of, it's a space where we are moving into co-creation conversations. So where, as a group, the act of conversation allows us to co-create, to weave all of our different perspectives together, to weave our insights and experiences together to co-create a solution, an idea, a decision. That doesn't mean it has to be through unanimous voting. It could still be that one person is the decision maker here. But the conversation, when I present an idea, allows a richness to emerge that means the decision I make will be better for this conversation. So that kind of more transformational rather than transactional, rather than positional kind of conversation is, I think, where teams need to think about getting to. And I say think about getting to because the first point is, do we even recognize those kinds of different levels? Like, I'm not sure how many of us sit down normally and think about the quality of the conversations we have as a team and think of them as having kind of different objectives, in the same way that, those four levels that Judith Glaser gives us helps to highlight that there are different kind of levels of conversation. And as a team, we need to move beyond simply the exchange of information, which a lot of teams never do because they're just doing status updates the whole time. That's not conversation at all. Or transactional, which is where an issue gets tabled, the boss of the table says, does anyone have an opinion on it? If not, let's move on, which feels like we're just ticking and flicking. That's not really conversational intelligence. That's very basic human communication. So the challenge for us is that we've got multiple points of view in the room. Maybe it's a complex issue that has multiple facets to it. The other challenge, of course, is that we've just got different people in the room, people with different preferences. There's those who love to cut to the chase, who get to an end result, who want to know what the outcome is quickly. There are those who love focusing on data, whereas there are those that like to talk about the big picture or to talk about the human impact of a particular issue or a decision. There are those who love to process their thoughts out loud or even need to be able to get to a point of clarity, whereas there are those that do all of that in their head and don't want to speak until they've finished thinking about it, and maybe, for that matter, think anyone else who's speaking out loud is some sort of a moron. There are those that are naturally curious about what other people think. There are those that are really comfortable doing lots of talking, those that feel like, if I'm doing all the talking, that's a problem. So we've got this wide variety of people in the room. So how do you get to a place where the team goes to itself, you know what, we are co-creating here, so what's that going to take? What does it take to get to that place of co-creation? I might come at this from a biased angle, and I think part of that is born out of the experience I had as an improviser. And I've talked about this background before in the podcast, where many moons ago now, it feels, I did a lot of improvised theatre, which is where you're working in groups, in teams, in ensembles, as we called them. You're performing or creating a show, but there is no script. But not only is there no script, I think the thing that people sometimes don't fully appreciate with improv is that there's no plan either. It's always sort of funny when you jump onto stage in a show and it goes really well, you'd always get people coming to you afterwards saying, that was amazing. Obviously, you guys have an idea of where the scene's going to go. And you kind of had to smile yourself, but the answer to that is no. We had literally no idea where the scene was going to go until it happened. And in fact, anyone who appeared to be planning in improv, we would call them dirty, rotten planners. You dirty, rotten planner, with a smile on our face and a glint in our eye. Because the art of improv still is the ability to get on the stage and go, whatever is here now is the beginning, and we will continue to create this scene, this show, this performance, this story based on whatever is given to us in any given moment. And those are called in the world of improv offers, and you're constantly looking for the offers and saying, how can I build on that? And you'd sometimes get started by maybe asking the audience for a suggestion, a word, you might say, or might ask the audience, it's a special occasion. What's the special occasion? Or we're in a challenging scenario. What's something that you are scared of? So the audience would give you something, and that would be your beginning point. But from that point on, there's no plan, and there's no opportunity to sort of get into a huddle and say, okay, how do we want to approach this? You just do it. That art, like by getting into that world of improv, which is not something I was naturally, not something I was naturally good at. Maybe I did have a kind of a preference for working that way, because I'm a pretty intuitive operator. But it was very different from the world I was working in and studying at the time, which was law, which was all about planning, method, process, analysis, critical thinking. So for a team to, and that distinction's useful, right, as well, which is for a team to be able to say, sometimes our problem-solving, critical thinking, analytical minds are the things that get in the way of us kind of really unleashing or discovering or or harnessing or tapping into the potential in this room, because we need to create space for not yet knowing the answer. We need to create space for not yet being an expert. We need to create space for conversations to emerge. And so if there's one word that I would say is critical, or one idea that is critical to building conversational intelligence, it starts with a willingness to give conversations space. That's the biggest shift from that transactional and information sharing piece to instead the space to discover, the space to build something, the space to create something, and to do that together, which means we also need the space to bring different perspectives into the mix. So, I don't know, you might be listening to all of this going, yeah, I love all of this. This makes perfect sense. Or maybe you're listening to it and going, I don't have time for this. I think the big question for anyone listening to this, for you, might be, so how does this help? Like, how do I use this or draw on this thinking to help build conversational intelligence in my team? And this is, the intention here is not to provide a training module on that. But I wonder whether one of the simplest ways to begin on this, and this is something I'll do a lot as a facilitator, is to start with the question of yourself, perhaps, if you're leading a conversation or even participating in it. But even better, to ask this question of your team, and that is, how do we want to approach this conversation? How do we want to skin this cat, to use that old expression? How do we want to kind of go about this before we dive in and just have the conversation? So if the agenda item or the the thing that we've come together to talk about is how are we going to, what's the best way, or, creating a product roadmap for the next 6 months, or responding to customer feedback on the recent launch of X, or streamlining our reporting systems into stakeholder A and B. Whatever it is on the item, we could just suddenly dive in and start expressing opinions, or you could just pause for a second and say, hang on, how do we want to approach this conversation? Like, what are we trying to do here? So it might start with a question of purpose, something I touched on in the last episode when we talked about meetings. But actually, how do we want to go about this in terms of how do we make sure this is a rich and meaningful conversation? And that kind of investment in design and kind of getting really intentional about approach, that kind of investment might not always be warranted, or what's the word? There might not always be a return on investment of that. So you might not be doing this for small little transactional stuff. What coffee do you want? Well, how do we want to approach that conversation? Someone's put in a leave form. Who wants to sign it? Well, how should we approach that conversation? Just get in and answer it. But sometimes when you just feel like, there's a purpose here that is worth investing a moment of going, how do we want to approach this? And then thinking about that approach. A simple way always of thinking of that is, well, do we want to spend some time first making sure that we understand either the problem or the opportunity? So understanding comes first, and that means kind of starting with what we already know, making sure everyone here in the conversation knows it, so sharing that, and then also opening up some space for people to both build that understanding, so that's asking questions, but also then for other people to bring new perspectives in that we might have missed to help us understand the problem. So phase 1 is understanding, which means any interjections, any questions, any inputs, any suggestion, they all have to be about understanding, not solving, for example. So understanding is point 1, which then allows you to perhaps look back and go, all right, so now let's refine. So we move from understanding to refining. So now let's refine our articulation of the problem. So what's the question that we're trying to answer here? Or what's the outcome we're trying to create? Or what's the pain that we're trying to eliminate? Or that kind of much more crisp, precise question that helps us go, now we've refined what it is we're trying to do here. So we've gone from understanding to refining. What's next? Next might be diagnosing, understanding why it's happening, or spending some time analyzing, whatever you want to call that. It's like, so do we actually now really understand what we're dealing with here? So that's a bit of learning, inquiry, diagnostic, airing and discovering some assumptions that might exist within us as a team. So that's that next phase. So again, by having this kind of conversation and saying, how do we want to approach this? It allows us to say, all right, so we want to allow ourselves a good, 10, 15 minutes of understanding. We want to make sure then we spend 5 minutes maybe refining, and let someone write up the refined question on the board so we know what we're dealing with. Then let's do some diagnostic for 5-10. Then we'll do some options creation, some brainstorming, some thinking about, well, what are all the different ways we could deal with this? So anyhow, look, that's an example of the kind of agenda that you might use. It's kind of got a little bit more, here's a training program on how to design your meetings. I didn't intend that to happen. But I think it helps to just crystallize the picture of how we can talk as a team about how we want to approach the conversation in such a way that gives us a shared picture as a team of what we're about to do here. Not to create groupthink. I mean, far from it. By creating a shared sense of how we want to approach the conversation, that empowers all of us or frees us up to contribute, because we're not sitting there now going, what, is this the right time for me to interrupt? Is my point of view welcome? I thought we were asking questions, but they're solving it, so maybe I've missed the boat. it just allows people all to not sit off to the sides going, what's the game that we're playing here, and therefore waiting, but to jump in and just play. I think that's incredibly empowering for a team, and it helps to then unlock all these kinds of diverse points of view that should be a team's strength, but sometimes is not. So when I think of agendas, this is what I think of. Like, an agenda is not just a bunch of topics that we want to cover off, but an agenda is a flow of conversation that, shows us through some clever design thinking how we want to get to the outcome based on the objective or the purpose of this conversation, which kind of is a key piece in this, right? It's the amount of time we invest in doing this kind of design thinking. How do we want to approach this is going to depend on the purpose and its payoff, the value attached to it. Is there enough significance for us to really worry about this? Obviously, if someone's simply saying, what coffee order would you like? We're not going to say, well, before I answer that, how do we want to approach this conversation? That could be overkill, but there's plenty of situations where it is very well warranted. That question, actually, how do we want to approach this, is actually a great way to just start all of this with a team, is to be able to step back and just start with that question. How do we want to approach the conversation? And by doing that, it equips us to just as a group think not about just what's the outcome here, but what's the process that taps into our collective power. This is what building conversational intelligence is. It's not like something you're born with, something you're not. Because in doing this, of course, the clearer we have this shared picture, we understand that we're therefore building that muscle together of collective intelligence. Is collective intelligence a muscle? I'm going to say it is. It is now. And, doing that together, but also individually, because then everyone is going to have their own strengths and weaknesses here. Like, there's going to be those that go, well, okay, if part of this is spending a good chunk of time understanding, then I'm going to have to bite my tongue because I'm always the solutions person. Or if someone's sitting there going, God, I'm the one who, I think I see things clearly, and so for me, the diagnosis seems obvious, but maybe we'll have to accept the fact that sometimes it's not, and if it's not, it might not be obvious to others, and there's no point in trying to solve, and that's why they don't participate in the solution, because they don't really understand why it's happening yet. So if we spend some time on that, then that will help everyone to participate. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe my diagnosis is wrong. So this is useful because it challenges my thinking. Lots in that, huh? So if nothing else, maybe a starting point for anyone, the invitation here could be to sit back with a team and go, when we engage in conversation as a team, when are we at our best? What are our best days and what are our worst days? To understand those two, and then to just bring to the fore this question of like, how do we do that stuff even better? And why does it matter to us? Plenty to mull around with there, surely. Plenty to be thinking about. And I feel like this episode has felt more like exactly what I wanted it to be, more like a conversation with you. Even though I can't see you and I'm doing this on my own in a studio, it does feel like a conversation because I kind of had some themes that I know I was keen to touch on, but I definitely don't have a script here. And I wonder, what do you think? What's your perspective on this? What insights would you offer about what works, what doesn't work? What are you wondering? What questions have you got? And as I said, just that email address again, you can just send me a note to say, hey, I'm listening and this is what I took from it. Or I'm listening and this is what I'd love you to talk about next time. So that email address is podcast@simondowling.com.au. I look at all of those emails. I read them all. And the other thing, of course, is if you're enjoying this, the other thing I would ask you to do is to jump onto your player of choice, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, whatever it is, and just hit the like button, follow button, whatever it is, just that tells the world or tells the system there's a podcast here and it's worth listening to. All right, that's it from me. That is our episode for today, Conversational Intelligence. I look forward to seeing you, speaking with you, talking with you next time. Okay, bye for now. Take care.